For the 17th week of Ordinary Time, I never recorded my homily when I was back at the parish, and I was in such a rush to come join my family for our little family reunion down at the ocean that I never got a chance to record it. So here I am. So we're just north of Pacific Beach in Washington, right along the ocean, and it's a beautiful day. So I wanted to record my homily from this weekend. And it doesn't necessarily tie in with this beautiful scenery, but that's okay. God created this, so we're going to enjoy it. I've been talking a lot about prayer in my homilies, and there's another dimension to that I've already brought up, but I want to go into it a little bit deeper, and that has to do with perseverance. Perseverance for us as Americans, it seems to actually come quite natural. We work really hard here in the United States. We even have a reputation of being go-getters, and we get the job done. And I think in many of the families I meet, they really instill in their kids just that attitude of persevering and working hard. And that's perfectly natural. That's a great thing. But when it comes to the spiritual life, there's another dimension to that, to the idea of perseverance. And it's the idea that we really are not here alone. We were not created just for ourselves. And so perseverance takes on a different dimension that we must have in our life, or else we lose our way. When people try to apply just this go-get attitude, just get her done kind of attitude to their spiritual life, it doesn't really work. So, for example, if somebody prays every day of their life, and in that prayer, it's very much an intellectual exercise, but it never really does anything to the heart. It doesn't change anything. It doesn't change the way they live. It doesn't change the decisions they make. In fact, it's not even really a conversation with God, but they get their prayers done. They persevere, but that's not necessarily the perseverance that we need. That's only a part of it, right? There has to be another part to it. Or families who are successful in dragging their kids to Mass. I shouldn't say it that way, but you know what I mean. When kids don't necessarily want to come, but they're successful in bringing them. And so they say, well, I brought my kids to Mass every Sunday while they were growing up, and I brought them to faith formation or catechism class every week. How come they left the faith? Despite that perseverance, there wasn't a deeper level of perseverance. And so the perseverance that is key to the faith life is the perseverance of the heart, not just the mind. And so, as I've said before, if you ever want to know why your kids left the faith, it's because they weren't in love. You can't persevere in faith if we're not in love. I want to offer just two examples that might help illustrate this. And so the first example, for no particular reason, I was just thinking about St. Patrick. So St. Patrick, I don't know if you know the story, but when I was growing up, I never knew the story about St. Patrick. I knew that we celebrated him every year. We would all wear green, and if you didn't wear green, you'd get pinched, and we'd have our St. Patrick's Day parties every year, and it was all fun, but why was he a saint? What was so special about his life? And then I read about him, and that's where I discovered. So, when he was a young man, actually when he was a teenage boy, he was kidnapped, and he was taken from his home. I don't know if you as a mom or a dad can understand the gravity, just the despair of a parent in having their child just disappear one day. And Patrick's parents went through that. Just one day he's gone. And so a group of people kidnapped him and took him to Ireland. He wasn't from Ireland. And he was enslaved there for several years. Now, as I was thinking about this, we have a lot of Hispanics in our parish. And if you ever talk to them about why they left Mexico or why they left their country, at some point you're going to hear just absolutely devastating stories where they had a family member, or they had a friend, or they had multiple people they've known who just disappeared, just because there's people who do really bad things in our world. And it's just way too common in Mexico and some of the other South American countries now. And so they come here seeking a little bit of safety. And so they would understand what Patrick's parents went through. Patrick eventually escapes from his captors, from being enslaved, and he goes back home. And when he gets back home, he begins discerning his vocation, and he realizes that he feels God's calling him to the priesthood. And his heart's open to that, and he's loving it. So he's learning, he's growing, he's developing his prayer life, and as he's getting close to ordination, to becoming a Catholic priest, he begins asking God what God wants him to do with his priesthood. How does he want him to serve? And so he begins to feel like the answer is that God's telling him is he needs to go back to Ireland as a missionary. I think only natural his response would have been, absolutely not. Why would I go back to those people? Why would I go back to my enemy? And so here we begin to understand the depth of perseverance, that is something so powerful for us as Christians. There's a reason Jesus in the Gospels repeatedly says we need to love our enemy. It means that when he gives us grace, there's something that he's giving us that we would not be able to live our lives in that way without that grace. And so the level of perseverance is God working in our hearts so that we can do things like loving our enemy and forgiving our enemy, which we would never be able to do on our own. And so St. Patrick keeps opening his heart up to that, and he eventually goes back to Ireland. He goes back to his enemy because he loves his enemy, because God has given him that grace. And so he becomes the father to that nation in terms of the faith. It's something so powerful, so beautiful. It's only from God that could happen. And he becomes their patron. He becomes their spiritual father, and it's beautiful. Ireland needs another spiritual father right now. I want to give another example. So this last week we had the feast day of St. Mary Magdalene. It was on Friday. And this year Pope Francis has elevated that feast day to being an actual feast, rather than a lower celebration that most saints have in our church calendar. And so you ask yourself, why did Pope Francis pick Mary Magdalene for the Year of Mercy and give her that increased importance? And with Pope Francis, obviously, he wants us to glean something from her life that's very pertinent today. I read a book about Pope Francis maybe about a year, maybe a little more than a year ago, maybe 2 years ago now. And I really came to understand him on a deeper level. It's very interesting because if you talk to people about Pope Francis, they'll often say either one of two things. They'll say that they absolutely love him. They absolutely love Pope Francis. And so then I'll ask them and say, well, what is it about Pope Francis that you really love? And they'll say, well, he's changing things. He's taking the church out of the medieval times and he's making it more modern, and he's changing rules and he's changing things. And that's actually kind of a surprise to me, because I don't think he's changed any rules per se. But there is a desire for him amongst people that he changes the church, that he changes the teachings of the church. He makes it more progressive, more liberal in some ways, especially the moral teachings. And he hasn't been doing that, but he has been doing something. I was reading an article the other day where people were lamenting the fact that he hadn't really changed anything, because that's what they wanted. And so those people see Pope Francis as a political leader, as a political figure who steps into the institution almost the way a president would, and then wields his power to change things according to a certain vision, according to their vision. And because he's not doing that, they're becoming somewhat discouraged. They don't understand Pope Francis. They really don't understand him. And then you have people on the other side who say they don't like Pope Francis. And so I would ask them, why don't you like Pope Francis? They say, well, because he's changing everything. He's making people believe that the church is completely changing and we're losing our faith. Now, again, he hasn't really changed anything per se, but what is he doing? So again, in coming to a deeper understanding of Pope Francis, even when he was a young Jesuit priest, he was caught in the middle. In Argentina, you had the rebels who were fighting the government, and the government was doing some really bad things. They were kidnapping and people were disappearing, and anyone who voiced opposition to the government would vanish or would be killed. And then the rebels would seek revenge and they would fight back. And the Jesuits, being a very, very influential group in that Catholic country, was right in the middle of it. And so you had Jesuits on both sides, you had bishops on both sides, the church was split. And Pope Francis was kind of right in the middle, and he would often tell people, he says, you both have it wrong. You can't be going down these paths of violence. That's not going to help anything. And so he was often sticking right in the middle and saying, we must adhere to the gospel. We must trust Jesus on this. And through the midst of it, he became alienated. He became unwanted. And so these both very powerful sides turned on Pope Francis, and obviously before he was Pope, and ostracized him and cast him out, and he was a nobody. How did he become Pope? How did this person who was hated by all of his brother Jesuits and the people around him, how did he become Pope? I have to believe that the Holy Spirit's at work. And so Pope Francis, once again, you see him in the middle, and you read his writings, and his writings are very Catholic, very faithful, but there's something different that he has. You see, I think Pope Francis has a unique sensitivity to people who are suffering. And people who are like that tend to be people who've experienced suffering in some way. It's been very close to them. And I can't help but believe that Pope Francis had something in his life that opened his eyes, and so he is not going to be ever the type of person whose first response when somebody does something really bad to come at him and say, well, we need to call the police or we need justice. Pope Francis is much more sensitive, and he wants to get into that person's heart. He wants to know why that they chose to make the wrong choice. He wants to help them change. It's a very beautiful thing when you think about it, but it's also very challenging. And so getting back to the idea of perseverance of the heart, that we don't give up on people. And so if we go into the life of St. Mary Magdalene, I think we kind of see if we understand her from the perspective of Pope Francis. Now, we don't know a whole lot about her, but there's a phrase in the scriptures that before she knew Jesus, it said that she had 7 evil spirits, 7 demons. We don't exactly know what that means, what it's a reference to. Is it possible she was possessed demonically? Sure, it is possible. Why it says 7 demons, we don't really know, but I want to offer a thought on that. As a priest, in hearing confessions and being a confessor and doing counseling, I have to say that, at least in my opinion, there is no greater evil that I've seen done in people's lives than when they've been sexually abused. And I say that just from what it seems the person goes through. You know, when a person's physically abused, they seem to get over it. It hurts, it's bad, it's always evil, but they seem to get over it. When there's emotional abuse that's done to people, we've all been bullied, we've all been picked on at some point. It hurts, it's bad, it's evil, but we tend to get over it. But with sexual abuse, it's different. it seems as though many people never get over it. It really and truly breaks them. It destroys their ability to trust. It destroys their ability to love. They put up walls all around them. It really destroys their understanding of their own sexuality as being anything positive or beautiful. That's one of the reasons why people who've been sexually abused often become very promiscuous. I was talking to one of my parishioners right after Mass, a police officer, and he says, Father, you're very right. He says, as a police officer, when you're dealing with prostitutes and you're going through an inventory with them where you're talking to them on a deeper level, and he says very rarely will you meet a prostitute that was not sexually abused at some point when they were much younger. It destroys them, and they don't know how to make good decisions, make loving decisions when they've been broken by someone else. And so I can't help but believe that perhaps there's something there for Mary Magdalene. Perhaps there's something that really destroyed her. And then in that, she ended up making many, many bad decisions, perhaps just from that brokenness, just from being so wounded. I come from a parish near a military base, my previous parish, and there post-traumatic stress disorder was a very real thing for the soldiers who were coming back from battle. Post-traumatic stress disorder often manifests itself in many different ways. It can be depression. It can come out as substance abuse, come out, again, promiscuity. It can come out in the form of even things much more serious like bipolar disorder or even schizophrenia. I mean, where there's real brokenness there. And people have been sexually abused, it's no different. They can manifest all those things. And they can even be like evil spirits. And sometimes it truly is evil spirits. Satan moves in when somebody is so broken. But that's not the end of the story for St. Mary Magdalene. There's a perseverance there that's much deeper. And so you can almost imagine that there's this moment in her life when she's tried and she's tried and she's tried and she's made many decisions about her life, and it's all just continued to be brokenness. And there's that moment when she turns to God and says, God, I just surrender my life to you. I just give it to you because I have nothing. I can't fix my life. And you can imagine that that's when Jesus enters her life, when she has surrendered. And so one of the keys to perseverance in the spiritual life really and truly is surrendering, allowing God to work. And it's only then that we're able to lower our defenses and drop those walls and begin to forgive and begin to find some peace in our life. So the ability to surrender, that is perseverance in the spiritual life. And so the readings for this Sunday, if you've just read them, one is from Genesis, and it's with Abraham, and he's talking to God, and you have this very long conversation going on, and Abraham's learning how God thinks, and he's growing in that, and so there's this perseverance. And then you have in the Gospels his disciples asking Jesus how to pray, and he begins to talk to them about how you pray, and he says you must persevere in your relationship with God. And so I offer that as a thought to you, that the perseverance that Jesus desires for us is not just intellectual, it's not just words, but it's perseverance of the heart. It's very deep. It's surrendering to God. All right. God bless you all.